1998, the bleeding edge of the 5th console generation, developers had finally unlocked the Z-axis. But, they were still struggling with one basic problem: what to actually do with all this new space. Industry default answer was run forward, blow shit up, repeat until the credits roll. But Hideo Kojima wasn't interested in volume, he was interested in vulnerability. You weren't some indestructible gun-toting tank. You were Solid Snake, sneaking alone through a frozen nuclear weapons disposal facility in Alaska. You were actively avoiding the core gameplay loop of literally every other title on the market.
You see, in 1999, combat was the entire point of buying a video game, but here combat wasn't the goal. Combat was a penalty for getting caught. It was a failure state.
The PlayStation hardware is what made this pivot possible. CD-ROMs meant massive, unprecedented storage, therefore storage meant room for actual human drama. We got voice acting that carried emotional weight instead of, just grunts and scroll text boxes. Cinematic camera framing, villains with complex, deeply grounded motives. Kojima's ambition wasn't to build a better stealth game.
It was to build a high-stakes geopolitical thriller, one that just happened to ship on 2 plastic discs.
Hideo Kojima had built Metal Gear games before, but the hardware was a tyrant. Early consoles forced constant compromise. Big ideas were routinely ditched just to survive the strict limitations of the cartridge. Then the PlayStation arrived, and suddenly the processing power existed to execute the one thing he had been chasing for decades. He didn't just want to build a stealth game, he wanted to direct the film. But navigating a full 3D space introduced an entirely new physics problem. In 2D, level design was graph paper. In 3 dimensions, sightlines mattered. Enemy vision cones were absolute. Therefore, when traditional sketching failed, the team did something crazy. They stopped drawing. They built physical models of the facility out of toy blocks, and they pushed micro cameras through the plastic hallways to kind of map out exactly what the player would see. It was a very analog solution to a digital problem. Meanwhile, artist Yoji Shinkawa was tasked with designing the game's namesake, Metal Gear. Now, the industry instinct in the late 90s was to draw a giant glossy anime robot, but this world required gravity. The result was Metal Gear Rex, a bipedal nuclear launch platform that looked terrifyingly plausible.
It didn't look like science fiction. It looked like a classified DARPA budget error.
Which was exactly the point, because beneath the cardboard boxes and radar screens, the core narrative wasn't just about sneaking into a base. It was about nuclear proliferation and genetics and the messy, unresolved hangover of the Cold War. On paper, the plot of Metal Gear is like your old school action movie. A rogue special forces unit named FOXHOUND seizes a nuclear disposal facility in Alaska, and they threaten to launch a missile. So the government does what it needs to do. It sends in one man, Solid Snake. Your objectives are suspiciously clean. Infiltrate, rescue 2 high-value targets, destroy a bipedal nuclear tank called Metal Gear Rex.
Sounds like a Saturday morning cartoon, right? Or maybe a cheesy 90s action movie. But the strange thing about Metal Gear is how violently that mission briefing collapses.
Within 2 hours, you aren't just neutralizing guards, you're navigating genetic determinism and nuclear deterrence theory, and colorful, heavily armed mercenaries who spend half their boss fight monologuing about existential philosophy while actively trying to blow your ass up.
In 1998, this was completely baffling. Most games barely had a premise, let alone a geopolitical arc.
But here, we were forced to sit through 10-minute radio conversations, dramatic, convoluted betrayals, scenes ripped straight from a Tom Clancy paperback. Sometimes it was brilliant, sometimes it was other bullshit, but either way it worked. It made the world feel infinitely larger than the gray concrete corridors you were hiding in. Because by the time Snake actually discovers what's happening in Shadow Moses, the stealth operation is completely irrelevant. It's no longer about stopping a tank. It's a tragedy. It's a quiet, miserable reflection on the legacy of men built entirely for war.
The narrative wasn't the only thing resisting the era. The mechanics were actively hostile to the 90s console player.
A decade of arcade design had conditioned us to push the D-pad forward and hold down the fire button. Metal Gear Solid punished this muscle memory immediately. You were dropped into a space governed by sightlines, cameras swept the walls, guards walked strict, mathematically rigid patrol routes. Therefore, treating Shadow Moses like a Doom level wasn't just a mistake, it was a mathematical error. Because the second a single pixel of Snake's shoulder clipped the guard's vision cone, chaos. The music spiked, the exits locked. The game stopped being a tactical simulator and instantly became a frantic, deeply embarrassing scramble to find a locker to shove your ass into. To survive, you had to unlearn momentum. You had to stop. The Soliton Radar was the true protagonist of the game. It rendered enemies' vision as this hard cone on a two-dimensional map.
That simple thing was a masterstroke in UI design because it meant that stuff wasn't this frustrating guessing game determined by the clumsy, drunken camera angles of early 3D. It was a readable interface. You knew exactly what the enemy could see.
But the tools you used to exploit that information were delightfully absurd. I mean, you could knock on concrete walls to manipulate the AI's path. You could leave footprints in the snow to set a trap. Or famously, you could just equip a cardboard box. An elite genetically modified super soldier squatting underneath a shipping container while a heavily armed mercenary decides the sudden appearance of a box in a highly secured nuclear hallway was, probably just a coincidence. I'm sure it's nothing. I mean, it was ridiculous, but mathematically, it was also flawless. When stealth broke down, the game shifted into a strict time phase. Alert, evasion, caution, normal.
This rhythm, the slow wait, the sudden panic, the agonizing cooldown, it produced an emotion that was entirely absent from most action games at the time. It didn't generate adrenaline. It engineered tension.
That deeply uncomfortable situation of pressing your digital back against a polygon wall and watching that cone sweep inches past your face and praying to the hardware that you wouldn't be seen. In the late 90s, the autonomy of a boss fight was settled science. A locked room, a massive health bar, you shoot the glowing red geometry until the problem stopped moving. Metal Gear Solid rejected that premise entirely. FOXHOUND wasn't a series of roadblocks. They were a roster of heavily armed tactical psychopaths who felt like they just wandered in from a completely different genre. Revolver Ocelot wasn't a DPS check, he was a sadist demanding an audience for his reload animation. Sniper Wolf turned a blank snowfield into an exercise in agonizing shivering patience.
But to really understand the true impact of these encounters, you have to remember how information, actually flowed in 1998.
There were no video tutorials, widespread boards didn't exist. If you hit a wall, you relied on expensive paper strategy guides or dial-up text boards or sheer playground rumor. Therefore, when you reached Psycho Mantis, you were entirely on your own against a piece of software, and I can't stress this enough, that was actively cheating. Mantis didn't just break the fourth wall, he demolished the hardware. He read your physical memory card, he judged your save files, he commanded you to put your controller on the floor and use the rumble motors to physically vibrate the plastic across your carpet. And when the fight finally started, you couldn't hit him. He dodged every bullet because he was reading your literal controller inputs.
The solution wasn't a larger gun, it was a physical exploit. You simply unplugged your controller from port 1, jam it into port 2.
This was the exact moment that gray box under your television stopped being a toy and felt entirely aware of you. Metal Gear Solid understood something that the rest of the industry was just starting to learn. A boss fight shouldn't just drain your ammo. It should leave a scar, sometimes tragic, sometimes deeply absurd, but permanently memorable. To understand why Metal Gear Solid landed with such an impact, you have to look at the geometry of 1998. The industry had just discovered the 3D space. Most developers were using this new processing power to build larger arenas or spawn more targets, but Kojima didn't use the hardware to build a bigger gun. He used it to build a camera. Instead of just mindless progression, he staged scenes. He utilized dramatic framing. He paused a high-stakes military infiltration to deliver a 21-minute radio lecture about genetics and nuclear deterrence and the miserable half-life of career soldiers. It was incredibly heavy. It was also occasionally utter shit, but it treated its own narrative with a gravity that demanded to be taken seriously. Therefore, the mechanics had to match the vulnerability of the story.
Think about it. Stealth inverted the standard 90s power fantasy. You weren't this apex predator, you were fragile. Almost everything in the facility could kill you quickly.
The core emotion wasn't adrenaline, it was avoidance. The antagonizing tension of holding your breath behind a steel crate while a mercenary walks inches past your face. But mechanics and camera don't matter without friction, and that friction came from FOXHOUND. They weren't just a collection of disposable pixel targets. They were a gallery of damaged professionals, psychics, snipers, sadists, each carrying their own warped thesis statement about modern warfare. When you combine those three pillars, directed cinematography, structural vulnerability, villains who actually had something to say, the result is inescapable. It wasn't just a refined stealth game, it was the birth of the playable thriller. By the time the code was actually locked in 1998, the reputation of Metal Gear Solid had already outrun it. Konami didn't just buy magazine spreads, they distributed physical evidence.
Millions of players didn't experience Shadow Moses by purchasing the retail copy. They experienced it through a promotional demo disc, a small, tightly curated slice of the opening infiltration, crawling through HVAC vents and knocking on metal gates.
Therefore, the argument was won before the box even hit the shelves. Players understood the language of the game before they even owned it. When the full retail version shipped, the critical consensus was overwhelming. The stealth mechanics were lauded, the presentation was universally praised.
There was this persistent, quiet friction buried in the reviews.
Some critics looked at the 20-minute-long radio conversations and sprawling cutscenes and asked a very uncomfortable question. Was this actually a video game? Or was it a hostage situation disguised as a movie? It was a completely fair critique, and it was also the exact philosophical problem Metal Gear was forcing an entire industry to confront. How much narrative density can a game actually support, and how much control must the player surrender to really experience it? I mean, in 1998, no one had a definitive answer, and I kind of still don't think we do. But the consensus was absolute on one point. There was nothing else on hardware that felt remotely like this. Today, it's genuinely difficult to remember exactly how alien Metal Gear Solid felt. Not because the game aged poorly, but because the industry systematically stole its blueprints. I mean, before 1998, stealth was a clumsy, frustrating experience. Afterwards, it was a defined architectural language. Vision cones, phase alert timers, rigid patrol paths.
On the PlayStation, these were bizarre eccentricities, but within 5 years, it became the mandatory infrastructure for Splinter Cell and Hitman, an entire generation of avoidance simulators.
But the mechanical legacy is only half the autopsy. I mean, video games had text boxes, they had lore, but Metal Gear Solid delivered staging. It delivered voice actors who didn't sound like they were reading their lines at gunpoint.
More importantly, it introduced the console market to a concept that Hollywood had understood for decades, that a piece of software didn't just need a developer or development team or a publisher, it needed a director.
This was the exact moment the auteur theory crashed into the medium. It permanently welded Hideo Kojima's name to the franchise, for better and occasionally for a hell of a lot worse. I mean, Metal Gear Solid didn't just launch a successful intellectual property, it forced an entire industry to sit down, shut up, and realize what a gray plastic box was actually capable of. Today, the autopsy of Metal Gear Solid is usually reduced to its loudest moments. The telepath judging your save file, the sniper bleeding out in a snow-covered field, the panicked, echoing scream of your commanding officer when you failed, and, the box, of course.
What have you got there? A cardboard box?
But the game didn't endure simply because of a few memorable parlor tricks. I mean, it endured because of the gravity it left behind. I mean, think about it. We were a generation conditioned on rescuing royalty and collecting floating geometry.
Therefore, a narrative about genetic determinism and nuclear proliferation and the political abandonment of soldiers felt impossibly heavy. I mean, it made patience a more valuable weapon than a rifle. In 1998, we didn't have a vocabulary for this. We didn't call it cinematic gameplay. We just knew that when the credits finally rolled, we hadn't just beaten a piece of software. We had survived the goddamn mission, and it was going to stay with us for a very, very long time.
What's wrong? Snake!